Hey guys, and welcome back to Annie Narrates. Here we review stories that beautiful people like yourselves post on the internet. Today's story's title goes like this. Husband of 3 years demands that I go back to work the day after I give birth because he quit his job without telling me. I laugh in his face and hand him these papers, and now he regrets everything he said. A 27 female gave birth to a healthy baby girl last week, but unfortunately, I've been more occupied with my soon-to-be ex-husband than my daughter recently. My husband, 30 male, had been acting shady for the past couple of months leading up to the delivery, and I found out after I gave birth that the reason he was acting that way was that he'd quit his job without discussing it with me first, or bothering to check with me if I'd be okay with it. We've been married for 2 years, and we were in a relationship for 3 years before that. All throughout, he's been working in the corporate world. He has a 9-to-5 job and has made considerable progress over the years, so currently he has a significant income. I also have a corporate job with a similar income, but the difference is that I wanted this for myself and I actually enjoy the work I do. A lot of people might look at this as boring or whatever, but I like my job. My husband, unfortunately, does not like his job at all and constantly talked about quitting and starting his own business. I never stopped him, but he didn't want to quit in the initial years because he hadn't saved enough. Then we got married and bought a house, so that led to more expenses. But even then, I told him that I'd support him if he wanted to quit and start his own business, but he didn't. Years passed and he didn't do anything, and then I got pregnant. I told him that I wanted to keep the baby because I believed that it was the right time for us to have a child. Both of us were financially stable, and I felt physically and emotionally ready to have a baby. He was on board with it at the time too, so we went ahead with the pregnancy. Then, all of a sudden, he started getting really squirrely around 3 to 4 months back, and when I asked, he told me that he was having trouble at work, but he'd quote-unquote sorted out. I trusted him, and so I didn't ask much about it. I was also heavily pregnant and was not doing well health-wise because of the pregnancy, so I was more bothered about that than whatever was going on with his work. I forgot about it soon afterwards, but then 2 weeks ago, I was going through his phone because my phone was charging and I wanted to listen to some music. That's when I saw that he'd received a text from one of his coworkers saying that he'd miss working with him. I thought it was the coworker who was leaving the office, but as it turns out, it had been my husband who had quit. I'm not proud of it, but I did go through his emails to check out what this was all about, and sure enough, he'd put in his 2 weeks notice around the same time that he'd mentioned having some quote-unquote trouble at work. But he wasn't going to sort it out like he promised me. He had just quit and had been hiding this for months from me. I was furious when I found out because this meant that he hadn't had a job for quite some time now, but had been pretending that everything was fine. Even if he started a new business and was working on that, he should at least have discussed with me first before quitting. I don't even know why he thought it was a good idea to hide something like that from me. But since he wasn't at home when I found out and was visiting his parents, I decided to give him a chance to come clean by himself because I didn't want a divorce. I loved him and maybe still do somewhere deep down, despite the circumstances, but I couldn't stand that he'd been lying to me for so long. That day when he came back home, I asked him about how work was going for him, and he said that it was all fine again, but avoided looking at me when he was saying it and just acted very weird. He was never a good liar, so I knew that whatever I'd seen in his mails was actually true. I was very disappointed because I had honestly believed that he would tell me the truth if I asked him, and when he didn't, it was a huge letdown for me. I was already very emotional and hormonal because of the pregnancy, so for some reason I didn't confront him with the truth then and there, but chose to wait it out and see what he does about the situation. I did speak to my parents about it though, just to be on the safe side, and they did advise me to discuss this with him at the earliest. I said that I wanted to wait and watch what he does, because I know if it comes down to it, I am fully capable of handling these expenses all on my own and raising my baby by myself. But I've spent a lot of time in this relationship, and I wanted to at least know what plan my husband had in mind to salvage the mess that he's made of things, or if he even had a plan or not. He'd been making a fool out of me for months while I was pregnant, so now I didn't see any harm in doing the same to him. My idea was simple enough. If he came clean to me eventually and took accountability, then I would stay with him and try to fix our marriage, because I was willing to give him that chance. If he didn't step up, then, well, I had already spoken to a friend of mine who's a divorce attorney and had her draw up the divorce papers, so I just have to file the petition later on. I'd even stashed a copy of the papers in my baby bag that we would take to the hospital once I went into labor in case he told me the truth there, and I didn't like what I heard. I knew this was a gamble, but I loved him and I was willing to do this for him. It was hard to pretend that everything was normal and fine around him for the next 2 weeks, but I had to do it somehow, and the longer he made me wait, the less hope I had that he would ever tell me the truth. Then, finally I went into labor about a week ago, and it lasted for around 14 hours before I finally gave birth to my daughter. He was there for me every step of the way, and for those couple of hours, I'd completely pushed out the thought of his lies and stuff from my brain and just focused on the delivery. Then, about 6 hours after the birth, when I was finally feeling a little better and my daughter was asleep, he sat beside me and told me that he needed to discuss something important with me. I knew what was coming already, but I wanted to hear it out from his mouth, so I pretended I didn't know what was going on, which wasn't hard since that's what I'd been ever since I found out the truth. But what he said was way worse than anything I could have imagined him saying. It was late at night too, and I was exhausted but couldn't fall asleep, so it really wasn't the right time for him to have that discussion with me either. But despite that, he went ahead and confessed that he'd quit his job a few months ago and had been trying to start his own business. Unfortunately, it hasn't been going well because even though he has his own savings to put into his business, it's not enough since he has to pay the bills and stuff as well. I do contribute usually, but haven't been for the last few months since I was on maternity leave for 4 weeks and would be for the next couple of weeks too. Unfortunately, the company that I work in doesn't offer paid maternity leaves, but I've continued to work here because otherwise, the work environment is great and we get paid really well. In the beginning, my husband and I had decided that I would take care of all the bills after the baby was born. Everything related to my medical bills was already covered by my insurance, so we didn't have to worry about it. He would cover the bills that he already used to, and I would also pay the bills that I would. All that would change was that he'd also have to split the electric bill with me, which usually I paid for entirely since I earned a little more than him. That was all the extra load that he'd have to take on financially, but otherwise, nothing would change. With our combined income, it was feasible and he'd still be able to save, so we didn't see anything wrong with it. But of course, because he'd quit his job in the middle of the pregnancy, it messed everything up and he hadn't been able to save money the way he'd intended to, and all our planning had gone for a toss. When he confessed the truth to me finally, I felt a little relieved because I thought that he would tell me that he had a plan for now, or would at least apologize and try to fix the situation, but instead, he told me that he wanted me to go back to work the very next day because we couldn't afford to stay back at home and relax anymore. I didn't like the way he phrased that, so I asked him what he meant, and he made it worse by telling me that while he respected the fact that I'd been carrying his child, at the end of the day, I'd just been sitting at home and doing nothing for the last couple of weeks. So now, I absolutely had to go back to work because otherwise we'd fall behind and wouldn't be able to afford the lifestyle we'd been living so far. I beg to differ there because his and my lifestyle is wildly different. He spends a lot more on hosting parties at our home every couple of weeks for his friends and coworkers, just to remind people that we can afford it. He's the one who bought a fancy sports car for himself earlier this year as a birthday gift, and insists that we go on vacations every couple of months, even if we don't really have to, and then spends a ton of money on those as well. This was a huge part of the reason that he stuck to working at his 9 to 5 job for so long. Because even though it wasn't his dream job, it still paid off all the bills, and he could easily show off how rich he was without having to worry about other expenses. I wasn't like that and handled my finances a lot better than he did. So if he quit his job, it meant that he wouldn't be able to afford the lifestyle that he liked, but I would be doing just fine. The only trouble that I would have was with the healthcare expenses because of the pregnancy and then my daughter, but I had enough money set aside. When he told me that I needed to go back to work because I'd just been quote-unquote sitting at home, I did the math in my head and realized that he was now counting on me, a woman who'd just given birth a couple of hours back, to go back to work the very next day, despite the condition I was in, just so he could continue to live the lifestyle that he wanted for himself and work in the business that he wanted. Things that he'd never even bothered to discuss with me first. Before I could even say a word, I actually ended up laughing because of how ridiculous he was being. It took me a few seconds to come to terms with it, but I already knew deep down that there was no coming back from this. I wasn't gonna waste any more of my time with a guy who thought that I was just sitting at home and relaxing when I was in my 3rd trimester. Even up until the 9th month, I had continued to work from home so we could stick to our plans in spite of all the discomfort and fatigue while he lied to me. I'd only started my maternity leave about 4 weeks before my due date, so his accusing me of doing nothing at home rubbed me the wrong way, and after he said what he had to say, I grabbed my bag, which was right beside me, and took out the divorce papers, then shoved those towards him. While he was reading it with a horrified look on his face, I told him that I didn't want to see him right now and that he needed to leave. I thought that he'd put up a fight and try to stay, but he didn't, and just left without a word with a shocked expression on his face. He looked hurt, that's for sure, but I was even more hurt by the things that he said and done because in my opinion, whatever he had done was much worse, and what I had done was just to protect my interests. After he left, I called my parents to tell them what had happened, and they rushed right back over even though it was very late and they'd already been in bed. They were the ones who took care of me for the next 2 days before I was discharged. I'd have to have an emergency C-section, so I needed more time and help to recover. It was painful, but once I was back home with my baby, I felt a little better. In the meantime, I told my friend already that I wanted to file the petition, and we did it once I was out of the hospital. My husband was served last weekend, and he hasn't stopped bothering me since then, even though he didn't check up on me while I was having the worst pain of my life in the aftermath of the delivery. He only got back in touch with me once he was served with a divorce, and now he claims that he was going to tell me about everything, but he'd just been waiting for the right time out of concern for me. You know, since I was pregnant, and that apparently meant that I was incapable of being rational or reasonable. But 6 hours after I gave birth was somehow a very good time for him to come clean to me. He insists that he kept the truth from me for my own good, but I'm not buying it. He even called me a couple of days back and begged me to come back home, since I've been living with my parents since I was discharged from the hospital. But I declined and told him that after what he did, I couldn't forgive him and move on anymore. He said that he'd already started working on finding investors, and that's what he'd been doing for the last 3 months. Making a business plan, talking to investors for funding, and just setting up everything, and soon enough he'll go back to work. It'll take some time for everything to fall into place, but he said that it won't affect our finances or lifestyle, and it's fine if I don't go back to work. He just wanted me to start working because then he would at least have a backup plan in the worst case scenario. But for me, this fight wasn't about the business or the financial part of it at all. It was just that he'd been lying to me for weeks and that he didn't even bother to think about me or my health before demanding that I return to work so he could have the life that he wanted after I'd given birth. He didn't even come to visit me to see how I or his daughter were doing because apparently he was in quote-unquote shock. Well, boo-hoo. I literally delivered a baby and then initiated a divorce and then had to deal with his man-child behavior all because he can't think of anyone apart from himself. I hadn't even blocked him because I had been holding out to the hope that he would come to his senses or by some miracle, things would work out for us. But after he decided that he was going to try and sort things out with me over text, and that if texting me didn't make me come back, then a phone call would be enough. I couldn't take that, and the very next day, I filed for full custody of my daughter, because I don't think a man who can't even be bothered to come to see his wife and daughter after everything that happened is a man who deserves to have them in his life. He was notified of that this morning, and he totally lost it. He called me once more, and this time he was hysterical. But I still answered because, like I've already said, I hate him for what he did. But I can't just stop caring about him or loving him with the flick of a switch. It's still really fresh, and that's why I'm keeping in touch instead of just blocking him and moving on with my life like other people under usual circumstances. He said that he just needs a chance to prove to me that he can be a good husband, and if not that, then at least a good father. He was begging me to not take away his daughter, but he hasn't even come to see her yet. When I asked him why, he told me that he'd been trying to speed up his work so he could win me back, and that's why he'd been busy. He also said that he wasn't sure if I'd want to see him, so he'd stayed away. Now I don't know what to make of any of this, and I feel like a total jerk because divorcing him is one thing, but here I'm taking away his daughter from him. Am I the a-hole for filing for full custody of our newborn daughter because my husband lied to me for 3 months about having a job and then told me to go back to work just a day after I gave birth? Hey guys, I'm going ahead with the full custody petition. I allowed myself to become weak for a moment when I was posting 2 days back, but I know that that's not what I need, and that's definitely not what my daughter needs. It's been almost 2 weeks since I gave birth, and not once has he come by to see us. It's just been my parents helping me out, and all he's talked about is why I should forgive him, that our daughter needs her dad, and stuff like that. Not one question about how I'm doing, how our daughter's doing, or even just any questions about whether we need help or not. All he cared about was himself, and I was an idiot to even reconsider what I was doing. He doesn't give a damn, and I'm not going to play into his tactics to get me back. Because this is just that, I wouldn't manipulate me into forgiving him for trying to play me for a fool. Reading the comments made me realize that I was letting him off the hook easily, right now by allowing him to even have contact with me. Honestly, that was just because I was feeling really weak and vulnerable emotionally, thanks to the havoc that this situation had created in my head. I am an emotional mess, and I don't know what I was even thinking. Letting him talk to me and guilt trip me for almost a week after he abandoned me at the hospital by myself just 6 hours after I'd given birth. I blocked him now though, so he can't get to me anymore. I've even blocked his parents and his sister because he might try to contact me through them. And additionally, I don't think they even deserve to be in touch with me because they hadn't bothered to check up on me either after their son left me. So why should I allow them to have any degree of contact with me or my daughter? My parents support this and believe I've done the right thing. I'm just sharing it all here to get it off my chest, and also since I'd posted my story here anyway, I felt like it'd be nice to keep you guys in the loop, because a lot of you were exceptionally kind to me in the comments. Some of you had very rude things to say, probably because you guys haven't read about how pregnancy and postnatal hormones can really mess people's emotions up. That's where I've been acting out of, my emotions. And I'm not as stupid as you guys made me out to be, or I would still be confused about what to do. But thanks to everyone for their comments, regardless of what they said, because it all did kind of help in coming to a conclusion. My husband hasn't responded to any of the petitions yet, and it's been a little over 2 weeks now, around 17 days. He just has 3 days to respond, and he's really milking those 3 days to make me wait until the very last minute. Either that or he's delusional enough to believe that I'll come back to him, even though it's now been 17 days since I gave birth and he still hasn't asked me a thing about how our baby is doing. I can forgive him for not wanting to check up on my health, but he doesn't care for even his own daughter. All he cares about is that the divorce and losing the custody of his daughter is going to be really depressing. That's what his biggest concern is right now, according to the email that he sent me from his dad's email address a few days back. He gave me a bunch of updates on how well his startup was coming around and how he'd even spoken to a couple of guys who he would be hiring in a few days so they could finally start working, as if that makes any sort of difference to me now. Then after that, he said that now that his professional life was finally going the way that he wanted, he also wanted me to quote-unquote drop this fight and just come back. I don't understand what he thinks is going on here. Really. Because he's acting like we're fighting over something petty, like who needs to fold the laundry. This is pretty damn serious for me, and all the hysteria and panic he was feeling when he realized that he was gonna lose his daughter seems to have completely evaporated now, since he has more work to keep him occupied. He mentioned in his email that I should be more supportive of him, since he's finally taken this leap of faith in his career, but instead, I'm making this very difficult for him, and apparently, he's had to make a lot of sacrifices in the last couple of months for me and the baby. I don't know what he's talking about, and neither do I care enough to find out. He ended the email by telling me that a life without me and his daughter would be really depressing, and he doesn't want that, especially now that things finally seem to be going his way. So, he thinks I'm going to drop this petition just because of a stupid half-hearted email that he wrote to me. He's an idiot, but it's clear to me now that this marriage was never meant to work out at all, because he's truly one of the most selfish and idiotic people I've ever met in my entire life. I am so disappointed that I didn't break things off with him as soon as I realized that he'd been lying to me. It would have saved me so much time. Hey folks, my husband's not contesting the divorce, but he does want partial custody of our daughter. I don't know how he thinks that's going to work, because he hasn't even seen her once, and neither has he asked about her, so proving that he doesn't give a damn will be quite easy for me. I already have the text that he sent me over the course of the last 2 weeks, and none of them mention anything about our daughter and how she's doing. Besides, there is also the fact that he abandoned us at the hospital. I'm not too worried about what's going to happen because he's dug himself a hole that he cannot get out of, and my attorney is pretty good at her job too. So, no, I'm not very worried about any of this, and I'm pretty confident that this will all end on my terms. Alright guys, that was it for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and smash that like button right now, and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again guys. We will be seeing you in the next one.